With the Middle East on the verge of a major conflict, possibly involving the full-scale participation of the US military, memories have been evoked of a controversial incident that took place during a past conflict in the region. The attack on the USS Liberty during the Six-Day War of 1967 between Israel and a coalition of Arab states was an attack carried out not by an enemy of the US, but by a supposed ally. The USS Liberty began its working life as a light cargo vessel named SS Simmons Victory and carried cargo during World War II. Acquired by the US Navy, it was converted to an Auxiliary Technical Research Ship, or AGTR, which was the National Security Agency's euphemism for a spy ship. Its first spying missions took place off the west coast of Africa in 1965, carrying out signals intelligence, a role it would fulfill for the next few years. The United States declared neutrality during the Six-Day War, although it's no great surprise that this was subsequently revealed to be a sham. Before and during hostilities, President Lyndon Johnson was secretly supplying weapons systems to Israel in defiance of an arms embargo on the combatant nations. In anticipation of the imminent conflict, the Liberty was dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean to collect signals information in international waters off the north coast of Egypt. Originally slated to be no closer to Egypt and Israel's coast than 12.5 and 6.5 nautical miles respectively, Liberty was then instructed to retire to 20 and 15 nautical miles, before a final instruction to retreat to 100 nautical miles. Unfortunately, a series of mishaps ensured that these messages were not received in a timely manner. As hostilities began on the 5th of June, the Liberty's captain, William L. McGonigal, asked the U.S. Sixth Fleet headquarters for a destroyer escort, but his request was denied by Vice Admiral William I. Martin on the basis that Liberty was clearly marked as a U.S. ship and U.S. neutrality would protect it from attack. He did, however, note that if any attack came, U.S. fighters would be 10 minutes away. At the United Nations on the 6th of June, in response to Egyptian complaints that the US was not neutral, US Ambassador Arthur Goldberg countered that the Sixth Fleet were far from the conflict. Whilst this was true at the time, by overnight on the 7th to the 8th of June, Liberty was 13 kilometres off the coast, having not received the order to withdraw that came at 3:10 a.m. local time on the 8th. By 9 a.m. local time, Liberty had been overflown by various aircraft from the Israeli Air Force. Liberty crewmen reported that aircraft had buzzed close enough for them to wave to the pilots. Israeli Central Coast Command had received a report at 5:45 a.m. that morning of the Liberty's position, and the vessel was designated as unidentified. By 6 a.m., the ship was reported by an Israeli aerial observer, Major Uri Meretz, to be a U.S. Navy supply ship, and by 9 a.m., the Liberty was redesignated as neutral. By 9:40 a.m., further reports clarified that the vessel was indeed USS Liberty. At 11:24, the Israeli Navy received a report that Arish on the Sinai Peninsula was being shelled. 3 torpedo boats, T-203, 204, and 206, were dispatched to the area in order to patrol 20 kilometers north of Arish. IDF Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin feared that shelling of Arish could be the prelude to an Egyptian landing there that could leave Israeli forces in the area outflanked. He was cautious about sinking any ships in the area though. As well as Liberty, Soviet ships were known to be nearby. The Liberty was tracked and reported to be moving at a speed of 28 knots, far above its top speed, and way above its usual speed for signals intelligence operations of 5 knots. This complete miscalculation gave the mistaken impression that it must have been an Egyptian warship, so 2 Mirage 3 fighter aircraft were dispatched to the ship's location. They duly arrived at the Liberty close to 1400 hours. Formation leader Captain Iftak Spector reported back that he believed the ship to be a warship, and would later claim that the Liberty had no clearly identifiable markings. There then followed an exchange at headquarters, which mentioned American ships in the area. However, at 1357, the chief air controller, Lieutenant Colonel Shmuel Kislev, cleared the Mirages to attack. They dove on the Liberty, firing with 30mm cannons. The crew had just completed a drill and were in stand-down mode, though the ship's 450 caliber guns were manned. 8 crewmen were either killed instantly or died later. 75 were injured, including Captain McGonigal, who was hit in the right thigh and arm. McGonigal sent an urgent request to the 6th Fleet stating, quote, "Under attack by unidentified jet aircraft. Require immediate assistance." The Mirages were immediately replaced by Dassault Super Mystères armed with napalm bombs, which they unloaded on the Liberty, causing the structure of the ship to catch fire. The ship was also strafed by the Mystères cannons. Before they launched another attack, Kislev was warned by the Israeli Navy in the area that there'd be no return fire, and therefore the ship could be Israeli. After verifying with their own fleet that none of theirs were under attack, the Mystères were set to continue. However, Kislev asked for another attempt at identifying the vessel first. One of the Mystère pilots reported the ship's GTR-5 marking, and Kislev, realizing that the ship was American, immediately ordered a stop to the attack. Chief of Staff Rabin ordered the torpedo boats to remain nearby, and sent 2 helicopters to search for survivors. By then, crewmen aboard the Liberty had hoisted a large American flag to ensure identification. 8 aircraft had been sent from the USS America to assist Liberty, but were recalled once it became clear what had happened. At around 1420, the 3 torpedo boats were sighted approaching the Liberty in an attack formation. T-204 signaled Liberty to identify herself, which they did using a lamp, since other communication equipment had been damaged. The captains of T-203 and T-204 were convinced that this meant Liberty was an Egyptian ship, and continued aggressively. McGonigal ordered a gunner to open fire, but rescinded the order once he saw an Israeli flag. However, a short burst of fire had been issued, and the torpedo boats returned fire, initially with cannon, before firing 5 torpedoes, one of which struck the ship, killing a further 25 sailors. Further strafing occurred, with crewmen claiming they were fired on while trying to launch lifeboats. The torpedo boats continued to circle, until a final identification was made at 1530. The USS Saratoga launched 8 aircraft in response to the continuing attack, but they were recalled when the Israeli General Staff sent an apology to the US Naval Attaché in Tel Aviv. The torpedo boats offered assistance to the Liberty at 1640, an offer which was refused. President Johnson was informed of the attack, but originally assumed the Soviets were responsible. When updated that Israel was responsible, he conveyed, quote, "strong dismay" to their government, who responded with profuse apologies, and within 48 hours, an offer to compensate victims and their families. The Liberty's crew were able to keep the ship afloat, and retreated under her own power, ironically being met initially by a Soviet destroyer, before being assisted by US vessels. She made her way to Malta for repairs and was subsequently scrapped in 1973. In the aftermath, US Secretary of State Dean Rusk sent this scathing memo to the Israeli ambassador. At the time of the attack, the USS Liberty was flying the American flag, and its identification was clearly indicated in large white letters and numerals on its hull. Experience demonstrates that both the flag and the identification number of the vessel were readily visible from the air. Accordingly, there's every reason to believe that the US Liberty was identified, or at least her nationality determined, by Israeli aircraft approximately 1 hour before the attack. The subsequent attack by the torpedo boats, substantially after the vessel was or should have been identified by Israeli military forces, manifests the same reckless disregard for human life. Yet President Johnson seemed to accept the Israeli justifications wholesale. No discernible consequences followed. McGonigal received the Medal of Honor, normally presented by the President, yet it was presented by the Secretary of the Navy, in private. Other servicemen received awards. All citations omitted mentions of Israel, although a later award in 2009 to crewman Terry Halbardier did identify Israel as the attacker. A raft of inquiries followed, both American and Israeli. All official US documents were top secret, and the US and Israeli governments of the time issued a joint statement saying that the incident was an error and nothing more. However, the Naval Court of Inquiry did conclude that Israel had, quote, ample opportunity to identify Liberty. Admiral Thomas H. Moorer of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that he, quote, cannot accept the claim by the Israelis that this was a case of mistaken identity. CIA memos concluded that Israel's failure to identify was, quote, gross negligence. The Clark-Clifford report commissioned by Johnson concluded, the unprovoked attack on the Liberty constitutes a flagrant act of gross negligence for which the Israeli government should be held completely responsible, and the Israeli military personnel involved should be punished. Congressional committees were highly skeptical of the error claim, but were largely stymied in their attempts to obtain official documents. When some documents were declassified, they revealed that every interviewed crewman said the Liberty was flying the flag and was easily identifiable in prime weather conditions. Crewmen formed their own association, the USS Liberty Veterans Association, which has been highly critical of the government and its investigations. The official association policy is that the attack was deliberate. A number of Israeli inquiries concluded that the attack was an error and identified failings in communications, but asserted that the IDF conduct was reasonable. This will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with allegations of IDF crimes in succeeding decades. Rusk later commented further, I was never satisfied with the Israeli explanation. Their sustained attack to disable and sink Liberty precluded an assault by accident or some trigger-happy local commander. Through diplomatic channels, we refused to accept their explanations. I didn't believe them then, and I don't believe them to this day. The attack was outrageous. Israel can point to mistakes happening in war, friendly fire incidents, and all manner of other fog of war incidents. It has also been supposed that Israel had absolutely no motive to attack the Liberty. Yet there are plausible possible motives. Israel didn't want any signals intelligence monitoring in the area at the time. Shortly after the attack on the Liberty, they invaded and occupied the Golan Heights. Not only would this have not gone down well in Washington, it would almost certainly have been intercepted by the Soviets, who were playing the same game as the US, feigning neutrality while being favourable to one side in the conflict. Another theory is that the IDF were carrying out atrocities in Arish against Egyptian prisoners of war, and didn't want this to be discovered. The evidence on whether atrocities were carried out in Arish is mixed. Yet another theory is one that regularly recurs, even around today's conflict, that the attack on the Liberty was an attempted false flag to draw the US into the conflict by blaming Egypt. No direct evidence of this has been uncovered thus far. In 2003, the NSA released tapes and transcripts of what they said were the only intercepts they had of the incident. It appears to back the mistaken identity claim in some respects, but is not a conversation involving all the participants. It also confirms that no definitive identification had been made. The NSA is also still holding, quote, boxes and boxes of documents that it has consistently rejected FOIA requests for. The Chicago Tribune reported on the 2nd of October 2007 that sources briefed them that the NSA has many more recordings than they have admitted. Furthermore, that they include evidence contradictory to the official narrative. 2 declassified diplomatic cables from the Israeli ambassador in Washington to Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban seem to imply that at some point the IDF knew they were attacking an American ship, although it must be noted that the ambassador was quoting a US source and had no direct knowledge himself. There is no smoking gun that comes close to proving that the attack on the USS Liberty was deliberate, although the second attack is a lot more dubious than the first. A new inquiry, with all the relevant documents declassified, is warranted. Perhaps governments can never resist trying to hush things up, and will reflexively do this, even if there's nothing to hide. But if there is nothing to hide, then there's no reason to deny a new investigation, and with that investigation, the theories about a deliberate attack would be blunted. There are not too many fans of the IDF around at the moment, and that's understandable. But in all things, we presume innocence until guilt has been established. There's just not enough evidence to conclude definitively that a deliberate attack was made. Without transparency, people will be left to draw their own conclusions as to whether a US Navy ship was knowingly attacked by a country purporting to be their ally.